I hope everyone had a good afternoon. I hope you were able to get some rest, perhaps get some tasks that you'd been working on done, but it's good to see you this evening. A few weeks ago, we began a look at some of the kings, and it actually started with a lesson on a passage from Jeremiah. But after that passage in Jeremiah, we went to Nebuchadnezzar, and we talked about that king as he finally learned that God rules in the kingdoms of men. From there, we went on to the one that was in the reading, Belshazzar, and the writing on the wall passage. And there, as you have the writing on the wall, and you have Belshazzar seeking a reading of it and an interpretation of it, and then finally Daniel comes on the scene as the queen mentions him, and Daniel says what's going to happen. That Belshazzar had been weighed and found wanting, and the time has come for Darius, and the time of the Babylonians is past. And that brings us to tonight's lesson as we're going to look at Darius. I want you to come on there in Daniel chapter 5. There in Daniel chapter 5, as Belshazzar gave the command, you might notice that Belshazzar gave the command, made the proclamation concerning Daniel that he would be the third ruler in the kingdom, and that's somewhat interesting. We'll talk about why here in just a second. But then you have that very night Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. One of the reasons that I enjoy talking about these kings, and I hope you enjoy it too, is because even though they're foreigners, even though they are either Babylonians or here Persians, Medes, even though they start off somewhat godless, they end up glorifying God. You have these individuals in the highest position in the land, and they end up glorifying God more than the Israelite kings had done before they went into the captivity. And I just think it's fascinating as the Lord was working with Israel, working with Judah, as they were the divided kingdom. As much as the Lord was working with them, the Lord was also still working in the kingdoms of men. Not just the Jewish kingdoms, but all the kingdoms. And you see the effect that the Lord has on these kings. And we're going to learn from Darius tonight. And as we think about Darius this evening, you can see the sort of subtitle I gave it at the bottom of the screen, How to Live More Kingly. And I was just thinking about here with Darius and the other kings as well, especially Nebuchadnezzar, and how their accounts end. It makes you wish for good rulers in our own kingdom. It makes you wish for those that were in authority that they would glorify God like these individuals end up doing. But let's go ahead and get into it, and let's see what we can learn from Darius. Come on to chapter 6, verse 1. It says, It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 100 satraps to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. The first thing I wanted to say about Darius, and it's a very simple point, and I believe we made a similar point with Nebuchadnezzar. Darius appreciated those who did a good job. And it's just that simple. We would do well to recognize what Daniel is. Belshazzar, when he calls for him, Belshazzar calls him what he is. He is one of the captives. That's what he is. And I'm not saying that he was down in the dungeon or in shackles or anything like that, but still, he is a stranger in a strange place. He is one of the captives. And here he is, as you think about it, he has distinguished himself, and to look at what Darius does, he was giving consideration of putting him over the whole realm. And that's why I said you might remember what Belshazzar did. Belshazzar wanted to promote him to be the third ruler in the kingdom. Darius wants to make him the second ruler in the kingdom. He wanted to put him effectively over everything, sort of like Joseph and Pharaoh. But to consider that idea, and to consider Darius simply appreciating those who do a good job, appreciating those who did a good job, I want you to think about a question. Who is it who usually gets a new job? If you've ever worked in a factory, or if you've worked, frankly, any place, who is it who usually gets promoted? Is it always those who do a good job? There's actually a phrase. Have y'all ever heard the phrase of actually failing upwardly? Sometimes that's what happens. A lot of times those who get a new job, it comes down to who you know. And a lot of times in my own notes, I put it this way: it's the friends and family discount. It's nepotism very often, and that's what happens. Other times, those who get a new job or get promoted, it might be those who have money. Because obviously, if you have more money, that means you have more leadership qualities, right? No, not necessarily. Not by any stretch of the imagination. But to think about how the world works, whether it's nepotism or whether it's those who have money, we ask ourselves, well, why did Daniel get promoted? It's because he did a good job and the Lord was with him. And Darius recognized and appreciated that he did a good job. He would not have considered Daniel in any other way. What Daniel is an example of what is spoken about in Colossians chapter 3. Verse 22, bondservants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. And whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men. How hard would that have been to do in Daniel's position? He's a captive. It may have been difficult, but Daniel still does it. What Daniel found to do, whatever Daniel did, he did it heartily as to the Lord and not to men. Daniel did that, and Darius appreciated it. He appreciated someone who did a good job. You might think about just how unique Darius is in this aspect. And we need to serve like Daniel. We need to serve like Daniel, but we also need to be appreciative like Darius. And we'll say this: what we need to do in recognizing those who do a good job. In my notes, like I said, I put it like this: be vocal. Be vocal. And what that means is sort of like at the end of Proverbs, when it talks about that woman whose worth is far above rubies. Do you remember what it says her husband and her children do? They rise up and they bless her. They are vocal in their praise. When we see someone doing a good job, what we need to do is to not let it slide. If we see someone doing a good job, don't just say, well, that's their duty. That's their duty. In the New Testament, in the Gospel of Luke, when it talks about it, and it says, when we have done everything that we are commanded to do, we are to say we are unprofitable servants. That verse is being spoken from our perspective, okay? We need to see ourselves that way. This is how we look at ourselves. We're not puffed up with pride. We have simply done what we've been commanded to do. From the Lord's perspective, and by the Lord's grace and mercy, what does the Lord say? He says, well done, thou good and faithful servant. That is how we need to treat others. Whether it's our children, whether it's our brethren, whoever it is. If we see someone who's doing a good job, we need to tell them thank you. We need to be thankful. We need to be vocal. And we need to praise them in that sense. And we need to praise the Lord for them. That's one of the reasons, let your light so shine before men, that when they see your good works, they glorify God. Right? You might consider Darius. I just appreciate him because he appreciated those who do a good job. I also say this, kind of from a negative slant. Sometimes when we see those who do a good job, we are tempted to be jealous. When we see someone who is prospering, here Daniel and these other governors who are about to be under Daniel, they get jealous, they get angry. And sometimes when we see others prosper, or we see others being appreciated, Sometimes we become jealous. Sometimes it's easy to become hateful. Sometimes it's easy to become proud and say, well, no one ever promoted me. Well, no one ever thanked me. And we need to just be careful with our heart and our mind. And we need to make sure that we're meditating on those things that are good. And we need to rejoice. And we'll talk more about rejoicing here in just a moment. But Darius simply appreciated those who did a good job. Also, read on verse 8. Verse 8, as the men come to him, and hopefully we're familiar with the account, but down in verse 8, they say, now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. Right? Because they could not find anything to charge against Daniel. That's verse 5. So they end up coming up with this scheme. And they're going to have Darius make this royal statute and make a firm decree there in verse 7 that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days except the king would be cast into the den of lions. So they come to the king and they say, establish the decree. Verse 9, therefore King Darius signed the written decree. Verse 10, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room with his window open towards Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. I appreciated Brace's lesson last Sunday. He talked about making a list of things that we were grateful for. And here Daniel, even in the midst of the captivity, what did he give? He gave thanks. It's a good thing and a good example for us. Verse 11. Then these men assembled, found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God, and they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. And they said, have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing is true according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. So they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, you might notice that Daniel, who's one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, because he had been hoodwinked. He was greatly displeased with himself and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men approached the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed. Now, what I wanted you to key in on was verse 14. When King Darius, he set his heart on Daniel to deliver him and labored till the going down of the sun to do exactly that. What was Darius trying to do? I appreciate Darius because what he was doing, he was abiding by the law. And he was trying to lawfully figure out a way to save Daniel. He set his heart upon delivering him. But that idea of laboring till the going down of the sun to do that, he's trying to find a legal way out of this problem that he's found himself in. He's trying to deliver Daniel. And he's trying to legally find a way to do it. Now, he is a head of state. That's what he is. Now, what are most heads of state going to do? Right? As you think about it, most heads of state, most kings are going to say, I'm the king, I can do whatever I want. Right? Most kings are going to say, I made the law, and I can unmake the law. Most kings are going to say, yeah, I made the law, but I'm the king, and I can break the law. I'll tell you right now, I personally don't care for, and I'm sure there's good reasons for it. At the end of most presidencies, there are usually a round of pardons. And I'm not sure how you feel about that idea. But you might consider, here are individuals who have been legally tried, legally found guilty, And the president, not just this past president, but pretty much all the presidents, they say, nope, we're just going to pardon them. We're just going to pardon them. You might consider Darius as a counterexample. Darius doesn't say, I'm going to do what I want to do because I have the power to do it. Darius says, I'm going to keep the law. I'm going to try to get Daniel out of this. But he labored until the sun going down to deliver him. But of course it was to no avail. At least he couldn't do it through the law. And you can tell there's something peculiar about this law. Early in verse 8, as they come to him and they say, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. There's something peculiar about their system of laws. And you might think about, even within this country, how difficult is it for a law to change? And I am in no way an expert on laws and things like that and the workings of government, but how difficult is it for the laws to change in this land? Now ask yourself a secondary question. How difficult is it to change the Constitution? Oh, that becomes a whole lot more difficult. Well, the Medes and the Persians, apparently they had a system of laws in government that if it was written a certain way and the king signed off on it, then nobody could change it, not even the king. That was how these laws and this law worked. No one's going to change the law, even the king. And Darius abided by that law. He didn't like it. He was trying to save Daniel and do everything he could, but he abided by the law. He recognized that nobody was above the law, even he himself. In Romans 13, verse 1, it says, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. You might think about, and I wasn't sure, this is kind of a chicken and an egg kind of thing. Darius did not just recognize the law. He recognized the authority behind the law. Like I said, you could flip it. He didn't just recognize the authority, he recognized the law behind the authority. Whatever the case may be, he abided by the law. He recognized, no, once it's a law, it is a law. And there is nothing that he could do to change it. Even though he tried to save Daniel, it was going to be in the Lord's hands. Just consider Darius, and just simply consider it this way. In a day and age where most people do not care about the law, just think about it that way. And we're finding this play out in our own government, and in governments, frankly, the world over. In a day and age where most heads of state don't really care about the law that much, is Darius different? He abided by the law. And in that, he's a wonderful example. Now, what he had to do, of course, is there in verse 16. There in verse 16, because Darius does not just give up. The king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. You want to talk about flabbergasting. That comment by Darius, that is flabbergasting. It is almost similar to, Andrew led a song about Abraham. Do you remember when Abraham goes up on Mount Moriah with Isaac? And he says, me and the lad will come back. He doesn't say maybe. He doesn't say if. He says, we will come back. Darius gave the command, cast Daniel into the den of lions. And when the king spoke to Daniel, he said, your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. That is an amazing statement. Verse 17, then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signets of the Lord's, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. So at this point, what could Darius do? Just give up? He didn't just give up. He simply put it into the Lord's hands. And it's an amazing thing. He is a Gentile king. And he says, your God will save you. Your God who you serve continually, he will deliver you. He is a Gentile king, and he becomes a good example for us as Christians today. In Ephesians 3, at verse 20, it says, now to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us, to him be glory in the church by Christ Jesus to all generations forever and ever. It is an amazing thing. That the Lord is able to do exceedingly abundantly. I don't think you can get much more emphatic than that. It's not just he is able to do above all that we ask. It's not just he's able to do exceedingly above all that we ask. He's able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think. That's the power that the Lord has at his disposal. So as we think about why does the Lord allow things to happen? Why does the Lord allow Daniel to be cast into the lion's den? He's working on people, right? The wheels of the Lord, they are turning. We may not always be cognizant of what he's doing, but he is always doing. He is always working in the kingdoms of men and in individuals' lives, trying to get us to where we need to be and where others need to be as well. Darius is a good example of faith. Your God, whom you serve, will deliver you. He puts it into the Lord's hands. It somewhat reminds me of Moses' mother. When the law comes, right? Because Moses wasn't supposed to live. And Moses' mother, what does she do? Does she just give up? She makes that little ark of bulrushes, covers it with pitch, and then she floats it in the river. And there Moses' sister is keeping an eye on it to see what happens. What Moses' mother did was, she had done everything she could, and now it's in the Lord's hands. Now, did the Lord watch over Moses? You better believe it. You better believe it. Because someone put it into the Lord's hands, all of a sudden, the Lord had one of his people in the king's palace. Pretty quickly, too. You might consider it. Here, Darius did not lose hope. He did not lose hope. And he recognized it was in the Lord's hands. Yes, he recognized that he had to abide by man's law, but he also recognized there is a higher authority than man's law, and that would be God himself. And that is who Darius trusted in to help. Now come on to verse 19. Verse 19, then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. This is after he'd been up all night. It says there in verse 18, the king went to his palace, spent the night fasting. No musicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him. Again, this is a Gentile king. And this is Daniel. This is a captive. And I understand he's high up in government, and I think he was a trusted steward, needless to say, of the king. But still, this is the king fasting. This is the king wanting none of the musicians brought in. This is the king worrying. In a sense, it's in God's hands. So what does he do? He gets up very early in the morning. Verse 19. Went in haste to the den of lions. When he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? And then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. Live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. You remember what the prodigal son says when he comes home? I have sinned against you and before my father's eyes, before God's eyes. Here, Daniel, not to say that Daniel had been perfect, but Daniel says, I was found innocent by the Lord, and I have done nothing. I have done no wrong to you either. Verse 23, now the king was exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of his den. No injury was found in the den. No injury was found on him, because he believed in his God. I appreciate Darius because it is a wonderful phrase there in verse 23. Now the king was exceedingly glad for him. He was exceedingly glad for him. It somewhat reminds me of a passage, and I'll just reference it. Remember in Romans chapter 12, it's the verse about weeping with those who weep, but it also says rejoice with those who rejoice. And that's what, as you think about Darius being exceedingly glad, you might think about it. Go ahead and come up to Romans, and I want to read that passage to make a point about it. Come up to Romans chapter 12. Leave a marker there. But up in Romans chapter 12, verse 10, be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor giving preference to one another, not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing steadfastly in prayer, distributing to the needs of the saints, given to hospitality. Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay you, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink, for in so doing you will heap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. But in the midst of all that is the idea of rejoicing with those who rejoice. Sometimes that is, for some reason, that is hard to do. Why could, I mentioned the prodigal. When the prodigal came back, why could his brother not rejoice with him? Why could he not rejoice? The father rejoiced. And I know the brother says, your son has wasted, right? Wasted wasted what you gave him on prodigal living, right? And he goes into some detail. Why are some people not able, why do they choose not to do what this verse says? That we should rejoice with those who rejoice. It might be because they're covetous. And we can all fall into the same trap. We can fall into the trap of saying, why do they get that and I don't? Well, that's covetousness. That's what that is. Or we may fall into the trap of just being hateful. And we may say, well, they don't deserve it. Right? I think that's what the prodigal's brother was saying. He doesn't deserve this. Yeah, that's why it's called grace. That's what grace is, undeserved favor. It may be that we fall into the trap of just being selfish and saying, well, I didn't benefit from it, so why should I rejoice? Right? And our mind might start getting twisted that way. We need to come back and we need to think about the idea of rejoicing with those who rejoice, because that idea may be at least near to the heart of what it means to be a Christian. When the shepherd brings the sheep back, are we willing to rejoice with the shepherd and the angels of heaven? Will we rejoice? Will we rejoice as the Lord rejoices? Will we rejoice with others, or will we only think about ourselves? You might consider it. To think about Darius as he was exceedingly glad for Daniel. It's just a lovely thing that here Daniel was. If the lions would have eaten Daniel, would anything have changed? And I understand the Lord has plans for the Persians and the Medes. But is anything going to change for the kingdom? Well, in a way it is, because they will have lost a faithful steward. But Daniel's just a captive. He's just a captive. And in that sense, he's just a slave. So if the kingdom lost one slave, it's real easy to say, well, it's just one captive. Darius doesn't do that. He rejoices. He rejoices that Daniel has been rescued. I want you to come up to Hebrews. Come up to Hebrews chapter 11. And in that passage that talks about all those heroes of faith, Daniel is not mentioned by name, but I think he's there. In Hebrews chapter 11, at verse 30, it says, "By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions." I wonder if that's not a reference, perhaps, as you think about Daniel and what he said. The Lord found me innocent, to paraphrase it. You might consider it. As the list continues on, and it talks about, verse 37, they were stoned, they were sawn in two, tempted. Right? They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth, and all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. And that's a wonderful thing, that we are in this together at that point. As it goes through that whole list of the faithful, they did not receive the promise, but now God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. And in chapter 12, we see what the better is. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. We have a better promise, we have a better covenant, we have a better mediator, we have a better priesthood, because we're on this side of the cross. And at this point, we're all in it together. They all those heroes of faith did not receive the promise, but now we're all in it together on this side of the cross. You might consider that idea and the stopping of the mouths of the lions. We know full well what the witnesses have testified, right? That idea of witness, it is the idea of testifying. We know what the witnesses have testified, and we know what the Lord has commanded as we look towards the invitation, because now it's on us. Verse 3, "For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. You have not yet resisted the bloodshed, striving against sin." That first century was so difficult. So difficult. And they were being exhorted and encouraged to resist and to strive against sin and to look unto Jesus as the author and the finisher of their faith. They were being encouraged to look to the same one that all those heroes of faith looked forward to. All of those heroes of faith, as they were acting in faith, they were all looking forward to the Messiah. And then he came. And then he came. And now he serves eternally. It is upon us to resist at this point, to resist against and strive against sin, looking unto Jesus. We'll say this. Remember what Daniel says? An angel was sent. An angel was sent to save Daniel, and Jesus was sent to save us. That is what the Lord has done. And we can learn from the account of Darius and Daniel and the others. We can learn from the account, and we can look unto Jesus ourselves as the author and finisher of our faith. But as you think about our points, and you think about Darius appreciating someone who did a good job, do you appreciate what Jesus has done? Man, if you're here tonight, if you're not a Christian, just think about that. Do you appreciate what Jesus has done? Do you appreciate, as Darius abided by the law, do you appreciate that Jesus abided by the law? Right? That law, when Paul talks about the law, and he says the law was good. The law was good. The problem was no one had kept it. No one kept it. The law that was supposed to bring life ended up bringing death. But you know what Jesus did? He fulfilled the law. He kept the law. Do we appreciate what Jesus has done in keeping the law so that those who did not keep the law, so that those who sin may find mercy? I appreciated very much Brother Greg's prayer earlier when he talked about, he used the word attorney, that we have our advocate, that is how Jesus serves us, that he serves us as our advocate. And as we come to him, we don't plead innocence, we plead guilty. And as we plead guilty, we recognize the power that Jesus has and his Father have. But as all authority has been given to Jesus, we recognize the authority Jesus has. Think about that idea. He is our advocate. That's a legal term. But at the same time, all authority has been given to him. He has all authority. All authority to do what? To forgive sins. So he is both our advocate and our propitiation. He's both of those things. You might consider it. Darius could not save Daniel, but God could. And it's the same for us, that we cannot forgive ourselves in that sense, but the Lord can. I thought we might close with the end of the account back from Daniel. This is what Darius writes. After Daniel has been pulled up from the den, Darius wrote, again, this is a Gentile king. To all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Can you imagine a head of state issuing a decree like that today? To all peoples, nations, and languages, men must tremble and fear before God. It's an amazing thing. But that's Darius. That's Darius. The Lord had saved Daniel. So as we look to the invitation, you might think about, we'll close with this thought. Darius rejoiced. The king rejoiced exceedingly. Do we want to make our king rejoice? What is it that makes the Lord rejoice? Over one sinner who repents. More joy. Just a lovely, lovely idea. If you're here this evening and need to respond to the invitation, either in becoming a Christian in baptism for the remission of your sins, turning from your sins, or in returning to faithfulness, there are lessons that we can learn from the Old Testament. There are even lessons we can learn from the Gentiles in the Old Testament. The lesson is yours. If you're here tonight and need to respond, please come while we stand and sing.